Thank you. Can everybody hear me in the back okay? You sure? Okay. Well, good morning. I want to just cover our objectives for this morning. My goal this morning is to get everybody here to have an understanding of how word-level reading works. Word-level reading, in other words, reading the words off the page. I have to apologize. I did not get to my room till a little after 2 o'clock in the morning. And if that sounds bad, you got to remember that's 4 o'clock in the morning for me, because I'm from Syracuse, New York, okay? So throughout this morning, you have to kind of function like my family does on a routine basis, which is you can't go by what I actually say, you have to go by what I mean. So there are probably going to be a few little misspeeches here, etc. So I thought today'd be a perfect day to enshrine a presentation I do using 2 video cameras, okay? So anyway, to learn about why some children struggle. You see, we don't have 2 different theories of reading. One theory of reading that pertains to typically developing readers, and one theory that refers to dyslexia. We have one theory of reading. And that theory of reading helps us understand both the reading development of most children, but also why some children struggle when they learn to read. The other thing that I would like to do is at least just introduce you. I'm going to be talking more about this in the afternoon, but just introduce you to the I call them elusive research-based reading interventions, because we hear that you're supposed to use research-based reading interventions, but no one tells you what those are. All right. So I'm not up here to talk to you because I happen to be particularly brilliant. Everybody that knows me well can testify to that. The reason I'm up here is because I worked for 28 years as a school psychologist, sitting across the table from children that struggle in reading. I started teaching part-time courses in learning disabilities and educational psychology back in 1994. But I didn't get up to speed on all this reading stuff until another school psychologist introduced me to this whole field of reading research. Tens of millions of dollars are spent in the United States alone on reading research, and that stuff all goes into journals, never to be heard from again, unless you're a reading researcher. So I got introduced to that back in 1997. So my first few years, from 88 to 97, working as a school psychologist. My first years from 94 to 97, teaching courses in learning disabilities. I mean, I feel like I wish I could go back and contact some of those early students and say, remember some of the stuff I told you? Maybe not so much on that. Yeah, I got some better stuff for you now. But what it afforded me was the opportunity, once I learned about all this reading research, I had access to it, because I had access to the university library being a part-timer. In 2006, those positions flip-flopped, so I was part-time in the school district, full-time in the college, which I am now. And this is only the second year in 30 years now, the second year that I haven't worked as a full-time school psychologist. But it was all those years of trying to integrate that research I was reading, the hundreds and hundreds of research reports that I read, with, all right, that's interesting, but how does that apply to this kid across the table? And so it was really out of that got me going, and that's why I'm up here. Not because I'm particularly brilliant. I can give you lots of reasons why that's not true. Okay, so what I want to focus on, as I said at the beginning, that we don't have 2 separate theories. The basis for intervention is any well-founded educational intervention has to be based on a sound theory of the causes of a particular form of a learning difficulty, which in turn must be based on an understanding of how a given skill is learned by typically developing children. And that's by 2 experts in the field of dyslexia. Probably, I don't think you can get a team of 2 people that know more about it than these 2. They're actually a husband and wife team. She is now the president of St. John's College, Oxford, which is the largest college in Oxford University. Most people don't know how some of these universities work. Oxford is multiple colleges. I don't know if you know how that is. In fact, here's a little trivia question for you out here in Colorado. I work for the State University of New York at the Cortland campus. State University of New York is the biggest university in the world. Most people don't know that. We're bigger than the University of California. There's your trivia for you. Next dinner party. You'll just really impress people. What's the biggest university in the world? It's the State University of New York. Really? Why are you even bringing that up? All right. So this is the citation. But this is the point, is again, to have a seamless understanding of how the reading brain works and why some kids struggle. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to, the next few slides are just kind of throwaway slides. They're not in your packet just to increase your packet for no good reason. I'm trying to prove a point in these next several slides. I'm trying to leave you with an impression. The field of reading research is absolutely huge. My estimate is there's about 700, give or take 100, 700 scientifically oriented research reports or reviews appear in English every single year. Now, I say in English, that doesn't mean they're all about English. Luckily for us, English is the international language for business and for science. So even research on Japanese or Chinese or et cetera, Spanish will also appear in English. They have some of their own journals too, but it's important for them to get it into the English realm. As I mentioned, it's very heavily grant funded in the United States and many other different countries as well. And here's the thing, there are many niche areas within that. When you have 700 articles appearing in the reading research, nobody can stay on top of that. I'm a member of the Society for Scientific Study of Reading. There's only 500 members in that group around the world. Now that may sound like a lot, but it's really not. I'm a member of the National Association of School Psychologists, and we have 22,000 members here in the United States. So 500 is not a lot. And in the Society for Scientific Study of Reading, which I try to get to their conference every year, we have individuals from Yale. We've got people from Cambridge University. We've got people from Harvard. We've got people from Oxford. We've got people from the State University of New York College at Cortland. Anyway, you go around at you attend that conference, and one thing that struck me the first time I attended was the humility in this group. I was expecting all these people with, big funded projects, well-known, maybe dozens to hundreds of scientific reports to their name, and I was expecting them to walk around with their noses in the air, they're big experts. It's amazing the humility that these folks exude, and how is that, and why is that? Because that's the nature of science, by the way. This may sound odd, you heard it here first, one of the major foundational elements of science is humility. Because you can only apply critical thinking skills if you say, hey, I might be wrong, I need more to learn. And I like to make a distinction between critical thinking skills, which is looking at the best logic that we have available, the best data that we have available to try to find out what's really true. And I contrast that with political thinking skills. Political thinking skills is not about finding the truth. Well, listen for a minute. I did a presentation on this to people from this end to this end in the political spectrum based on social psychology, and afterwards people from the whole spectrum came up smiling, shaking my hand, okay? Because I didn't bring up any specific issue. All right, anyway, so the political thinking is not about trying to find the truth. It's about, because we already have the truth. They don't, we have the truth, right? And so it's about defending the truth. There's no humility in that. So science is founded on humility. And here's what's interesting. One of the reasons there's such humility in a group like that is because there's so many niche areas within the reading research that everybody, no matter if they're the top person in their area, they know there are plenty of people that know a heck of a lot more about reading than they do once they get outside their niche area. And this may startle you, but one niche area of reading that I've spent a lot of time looking at is word learning. How do we learn words? How do we, you see a word for the first time and you sound it out, you guess at it, somebody tells it to you, whatever. But then eventually you see it, it jumps out at you instantaneously. How does the word get from point A to point B? How does that happen? Lots of research on that. And that's in one niche area of what they call orthographic learning. It has to do with how we learn words. Interestingly, there's a whole lot of research on doing remediation and intervention with children who struggle in word level reading. And the individuals who study intervention with word level reading never cite or make reference to the word learning research. And the word learning researchers never make reference to the word learning intervention research. Isn't that odd? I mean, it seems odd, but it's really not. The field is so huge. Let me give you an analogy. The average cardiologist isn't reading podiatry journals. The average podiatrist doesn't read ophthalmology journals, but they're all physicians. And so what I have tried to do is, because almost everybody in the reading research field is already specialized right out of grad school, because they go to grad school and they start doing the specialized area that their professors are doing, that they're working with. Well, I didn't do that. I went through a school psychology program, so I didn't specialize in reading research. I found out about it later, and my goal, of course, was the kid across the table. So I was more like our general practitioners, which need to know a little bit about podiatry and a little bit about cardiology and a little bit about all the others, right? And so that's why I've tried to look in all these areas and try to pull the best and present, you might say, reading research's greatest hits. So I think of myself as kind of like the UPS guy, delivering the goods, right? So we have a lot of different niche areas, and unfortunately, they're not all integrated with one another, and we need to see that happen to get a better benefit. Which we get very focused on the English language, as if that's the only folks that are interested in reading, but we have a lot of other languages as well. Every one of these, there's hundreds of studies in every single one of these languages. You'd say Turkish, really? You wouldn't think. Turkish is one of the two most rigid, well, I shouldn't say two most, but it's one of the most rigid languages in a good way on the planet. For every sound in the spoken language Turkish, there's only one letter that ever represents that sound. For every letter, each letter only represents one sound. And what's interesting, there's kind of a myth that floats around that we have more dyslexia in English than they have in other countries that have easier, letter-sound relationships like Spanish or Italian, and that's not true. They have the same percentage of dyslexics as we do, but the symptoms are different. Because we have so many irregularities, our dyslexics have issues with accuracy and speed. Their dyslexics just have issues with speed. They eventually get the accuracy because the graphophonemic connections are much more rigid. So it takes us, let's just roughly say, about 20 months in first and second grade to pretty much get the system down for children, right? For Spanish and Italian, it's more like 6 months in first grade, maybe 7 at the most. So almost a quarter of the time. Turkish and Swahili, 5-6 weeks. So 5-6 weeks in first grade, the kids have the whole thing mastered. In fact, I would tell you that those languages are so consistent that if we did a workshop here today on Turkish or Swahili and you learn the sounds, etc., you would be able to spell any Turkish word in their language or any Swahili word in their language. That's how regular they are. Okay? But anyway, the problem is they don't remember the words they read. Their dyslexics have the same problems as ours do. They don't remember the words they read. So eventually they get better at sounding out the words, but they don't remember them. And that's the part that I'm focusing on. How do we remember the words we read? And that's kind of the missing piece with all of the discussions on dyslexia. We focus so much on getting kids to sound out words they don't know. But how do we get to that next point where we then remember the words? And then look at all the countries that participate routinely in this. And that's not all of them. I mean, we have people from many countries in our group. Those 500 people, I would probably say 40% or fewer are from the United States. So it's very much an international group. Maybe even 30% are from the United States. Lucky for us, 2 out of every 3 years, it's the conferences in the United States, okay? And they pick these places. My wife and I actually go to these. I drag her along. Man, where did we go? St. Pete's Beach and Hawaii and... Anyway, it's just something you have to put up with if you want to do this. You all know there's going to be self-sacrifice involved. Okay, there is no one field that is the reading research. There's no one academic field that says we're the people with the reading research. Look how it's spread across a whole bunch of different fields. Now, you look at psychology and you say it looks kind of overrepresented. Is that because your area is psychology? No. Look at the institutional affiliation on many of those journals, and you see an overrepresentation of psychology. Why is that? The late Robert Crowder, who was a cognitive psychologist at Yale University, he pointed out something in his book, Cognitive Psychology. If you remember what cognitive psychology is from your undergraduate days, that's the psychology of thought and memory, right? How we perceive things, how we see things, we perceive it, we record it in some kind of memory form, organize it in our memory, and then we have some sort of output. How does that whole memory system work? Well, when they wanted to learn about that back in the 1950s and 60s, they said, what are we going to use as input for this? Well, we could use people's faces, how well they remember faces, or just objects, abstractions. We could use letters, we could use words, we could use paragraphs. They use all different types of things, but very commonly they use the fodder of reading. Letters, words, sentences, paragraphs. Well, 20 years into this, into the 70s and 80s, they kind of all looked at each other and said, hey, you know what? We've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies on reading and nobody knows about it because we weren't studying reading, we were studying memory. And yet we were using the materials of reading for that. So psychology has been overrepresented since the 1970s or even the 1950s on the reading research. But we have many others. Take, for example, speech language. 2 of our last 4 presidents of the Society for Scientific Study of Reading were out of departments of speech language. They make huge contributions to the field, okay? And there are many others as well. And I might even be missing a couple. Okay, a few key terms. Folks like you probably already are aware of these terms, but I just want to maybe fine-tune for some of you and for others introduce you to terms. And maybe for some this won't be any fine-tuning. But I want to distinguish between auditory and phonological. So everything we hear is auditory. But we have kind of a subset of auditory which has to do with the sounds of spoken language, both perceiving spoken language as well as producing spoken language. That's phonological, phonology. It turns out that children with reading difficulties do not have generic auditory processing problems. You hear someone says, well, he's got auditory processing issues. Well, technically that's true because phonology comes under the broader heading of auditory skills, but it's not very precise. It's really the phonology, it's interacting with the substructure of spoken language that becomes the problem. Then you have phonological versus phonemic. So phonemes represent the smallest units of our spoken language, and they are abstractions. I say they're abstractions because they don't exist in our spoken language independently. We have, if you could even come up with more words than you can count on one hand, I'd be surprised. Talk to me later, because I can only come up with very few. But how many words do we have in English that are just one phoneme? Someone tells you something, you go, oh. There's one word, okay? Then you have the article a or right? Okay, you got that. You're like, what about I? Well, that's actually two phonemes, right? I, yeah, okay. So, and then this isn't even a word. I mean, this is how I'm kind of scraping to try to find something. Those of you old enough, you might remember the old Campbell soup commercial. Good. You got there you go. There's the that's a phoneme, but it's not even a word. So phonemes are abstractions, but they only exist in the spoken language as a comparison. So had, hat, the only difference between those we define as a phoneme. And it only becomes important when you decide that your writing, I'll talk more about this later, but you decide that your writing system is going to be based on representing those phonemes. So phonemic awareness, so phonological has to do with a broader set of characteristics of our spoken language that would include things like, rhyming, alliteration, clapping out syllables, etc. Orthography and orthographic, these are two real trendy words in the last couple of years, often misused, unfortunately. But orthography is just a fancy way of saying correct writing. Orthos, from the Greek word, means straight or right, and orthodontist straightens your teeth. And so orthography means the proper way to represent something in a given language, the correct spelling. So B-R-A-N-E is not proper orthography. That's nothing. It's a noun-word. In the spoken language, you'd say brain, but that is represented correctly as B-R-A-I-N. The difference between P-E-A-R and P-A-I-R is orthography. And knowing the orthographic difference is what allows us to know which one we're referring to. Phonologically, when you say pear and you have no context, you don't know which one you're referring to. Phonological awareness versus phonics. A study in the Journal of Learning Disabilities in 2009, they did a survey of folks that teach teachers to teach kids to teach reading, to learn reading. 80% of those individuals couldn't explain the difference between phonics and phonemic awareness. It's a very common misunderstanding. I find a lot of individuals who do phonics instruction make the same mistake. I've run into many people that will say, they have the little letter tiles and they'll say, see, here's the word pat, and then we take away the p, and they'll move the p, and they'll put the c there, and they'll go, now it says cat. See, we're working on phonemes. That's phonics. That's phonics. If you see the letters, that's phonics, if there are letters involved. Phonological awareness has to do with the oral system. Phonics has to do with is a teaching methodology for the written language. And certainly they overlap because they both deal with sounds. That's what the PHON is at the beginning. Phonos in classical Greek means voice or sound. It can mean either, okay? Not to be confused with, we get our word audio, aude, which means voice or sound, okay? They mean the same thing in Greek, but so you talk about audio components, has to do with sound. Sight word and sight vocabulary, this is huge for this morning. I may get back to this a little bit later, but just a shorthand. The term sight word is used at least 4 different ways I've determined in the education field. Only one of those 4 ways overlaps with how it's used in the reading research field, and that's this way. Sight word refers to any word that's familiar to you and jumps out at you. It doesn't matter if it's phonically regular or phonically irregular. It doesn't matter if it's a very high-frequency word that you learned in kindergarten or if it's a word you just learned a couple weeks ago and it's a technical term, but now you know it and it jumps out at you. It doesn't matter. So that particular use of the 4, that particular use of sight word means any familiar word that we don't have to put effort into identifying, jumps right out at us. So a sight word vocabulary refers to all the familiar words that we have. So in a group of adults like this, we're going to have anywhere from 30 to 60,000, any one of us might have 30 to 60,000 sight words. 30 to 60,000 words that jump out at us. I could flash a word on a screen for 1/20th of a second, follow it by a bunch of X's to cancel out any after image on your retina, and you'd still get it. Any one of 40, 50,000 words. No context, no sounding it out, jumps out at you. That's your sight vocabulary. And children with dyslexia have very limited sight vocabularies. Typically, developing readers have much larger and ever-expanding sight vocabularies, and that's one of the reasons why we have this gap between the two. So we need to focus on sight vocabulary development and how that works. Also, the sight vocabulary, researchers use the term sight word vocabulary, but they also use the term orthographic lexicon. Why do they do that? It's very simple. It sounds way cooler. Doesn't it? Right? Same thing, though. Exact same thing. Orthographic lexicon, sight word vocabulary, interchangeable. All right, a couple important things about dyslexia. First of all, there's all kinds of definitions out there. I'm not going to go through them all. That's what the internet's for, right? You go find them. What I want to do is offer for you a researcher definition. I don't want to say it's my definition. It sort of is because I'm the one that put the actual wording together, but really it's a definition that emerges from reading hundreds and hundreds of research studies in this area over the years. And it's this, and it seems pretty simple, and you're going to say, wait, Dave, wait, you're missing something, but not really. Basically, dyslexia refers to word-level reading difficulty despite adequate opportunity and effort. Everything else is popular lore that's over 100 years old. Anytime you hear stuff about visual processing, et cetera, the big question is say, show me the data. We've been studying it for decades. There just does not appear to be any clear visual aspect. The only visual aspect with dyslexia is the input. Once that letter string is input, that's when words are remembered based on orthographic memory, phonological memory, and semantic memory, not on visual memory. And I'll come back to that in much more detail in a bit. The only footnote I might put to this is that it's not based on blindness or being deaf or severe, very severe intellectual disability. And I emphasize severe because kids with even mild to moderate intellectual disabilities can learn to read words quite competently. They end up being what we refer to as hyperlexics. So they can read, hyperlexia is reading above and beyond what you can understand. For example, I happen to be hyperlexic for Spanish because I studied it in high school, I studied it in college, and I can still read it, but I don't know what I'm reading. If I were to stand up here and read something in Spanish, I'd be fluent, and someone walking by would think I know what I'm saying. I have no idea, right? So I'm hyperlexic. Now you go, well, wait, what's the point of that? Well, I'll tell you the point. See, I've worked K-12. I worked 18 years full-time in a K-6 context. Then I worked 6 years part-time in a middle school, 4 years part-time in a high school. So I've seen the whole gamut. And what really struck me at the high school is we'd have some of these children that are graduating high school with a third grade reading level, okay? So let's just say, let me create a scenario, and I had these kind of scenarios. Let's say you have a child with a mild intellectual disability. They have, say, a 65 IQ, so they're in the bottom 1% of the population. And those children, their verbal reasoning is similar to, let's say, a 5th or 6th grader, if you were to do a direct comparison with their verbal skills. And their reading comprehension's at a 3rd or 2nd grade level. Why? Because their word reading is at a 1st or 2nd grade level. The word reading's dragging them down. So as one researcher who's now retired, Joseph Torgerson, said, we need to make it so every child, their reading comprehension is at the level of their language comprehension. So sending those kids out, those kids with mild intellectual disabilities, out into the world with a 5th grade reading comprehension is doing them a much greater service than sending them out with a 2nd or 3rd grade reading comprehension. So that's the reason we don't say, well, see, an intellectual disability is not a reason why a child struggles in word reading. They struggle in word reading for all the reasons I'll be telling you coming up, just like everybody else, just so you know that. There isn't a separate, well, I'm jumping ahead. So kids with SLD and IDEA, 80% of them have word-level reading problems. They may have other things. They may have math. They may have comprehension. They may have writing, spelling, etc. But it's huge. But also the relationship to other disability areas like I just mentioned. There's not a different reason why the kid with SLD is struggling at word level reading than the kid with, I don't know what the term you use here, like emotional behavior disorder, or what term, is that the term you use here? It's emotional disturbance, New York State and the federal. There's not two different reasons. And if they're struggling in reading, it's usually the same reason. Unless it meets that adequate opportunity. If the kid spends all his time swearing at the teacher and throwing chairs, which is my roughshod definition of emotional disturbance and how it's defined. No, really, because we have plenty of kids that have those problems, but they don't get identified unless they swear at the teacher and throw chairs, right? So we should never say the reason this child is struggling in word level reading anyway is because they have thus and such disability. No, we might say they're struggling in word level reading because, and rattle off the skills that go into word level reading. Big difference. All right, so let's take a look at what those are. The phonological core deficit, you can Google that, you'll get a million hits. The phonological core deficit is a term that researchers have been using now since the 80s. It really got picked up quite a bit in the 90s. And they referred to it in the 90s and early 2000s as the most common cause of dyslexia. But there's been a shift in the last few years. Even I read something out of one of the researchers down at Florida State. Florida State is one of the funding hubs for learning disabilities for the NICHD, National Institute of Child Health and Development. And they referred to it as the universal cause. That's an important shift to think about. And the reason why is because these are the characteristics. This is my division. Other researchers might do it the same way I do. They might combine the first two. They might do things a little just slightly differently. We're just cutting the exact same pie in slightly different ways. But this is my breakdown. These are five characteristics of the phonological core deficit, meaning you have a significant problem relative to your peers in one or more of these. And the reality is that most children with dyslexia have problems in more than one. There are some children, because I test these when I test kids, some kids have problems in all five. And we don't have evidence that there are children that have had adequate opportunity to learn to read, don't have sensory deficits like blindness or deafness, and they've had adequate opportunity, they're putting in the basic effort that anybody else is putting in, who gets a clean bill of health on these. We haven't found that kid yet. But also, it's important to realize that we have been looking at other causes for decades, and nothing has gained a foothold. Nothing has gained a foothold. So that's why it's referred to as universal cause. And as I go through this and I explain a little bit more this morning, it'll make sense. When we understand the nature of alphabetic writing, we realize that we have a phonemic-based writing system, and you struggle with phonemes, you're going to struggle with the system. And the visual aspects to reading are so simple. It's just simple data entry of letters and strings of letters. And that's, all the stuff you hear about the distortions, I'll come back to that, all the stuff you hear about the distortions of that just don't pan out. An article just appeared in an ophthalmology journal like just a couple weeks ago. In 2009, the American Academy of Pediatrics pulled together several optometry and ophthalmological organizations to put together a statement. You can Google it very easily. And they went through and said, no, we don't, it has nothing to do with vision. All right? But our intuition is that it is. But we'll go through and address that in upcoming one. All right, I want to do a little demonstration of dyslexia. I need two volunteers who'd like to help me with this little demonstration. Who'd like to do that? Okay, why don't you come on up here? One more? Oh, you wanted two? Okay, both of you? And if you could just step up here. I happen to be a part-time professional magician, and so I've done over 2,000 shows over the years. And if you could stand just off a bit from the podium, and then if you could stand just so you could be heard, just stand right here in front of this. And what's your name?
Ray.
I'm sorry?
Ray.
Ray, okay. And your name?
Monica.
Monica. Let's thank Ray and Monica for being willing to help out, all right? And I just realized my demo's down here. Let's see. Okay, Ray, here's what we're going to do. This is a two-step process. I'm going to show you a word, and then the first thing is you're going to tell me if it's a word you know or not. So the first response is yes or no. And then, if it's a word you know, say what it is. If it's a word you don't know, give it your best try and sound it out. Okay? All right, do you know this word?
Yes.
Okay, can you read it and say it?
Airplane.
Okay. Can you tell her what it says? Elephant. You may not be able to see it in the back, so nice and loud.
Elephant.
Elephant. Okay. All right. Do you know this word?
Yes. No.
Can you sound it out?
Puriwalgit. Periwalget. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we'll go with that.
That's what I'm going.
All right. What does it say? Nice and loud? Playwright. Okay. Let's go with this one. You know that word?
No.
Can you try to sound it out?
Escorprosi. Escorprosi.
All right. Class, you want to tell her what it says? Experience. Okay, thank you, Ray. You can go sit down. Ray, just so you know, when they were laughing with you, not at you. Although you weren't laughing, so they were laughing at you because they weren't laughing with you. All right. Such an insensitive group. All right, same thing. First question, do you know the word, yes or no? And if you, then the second, read the word. Do you know this word?
Yes.
What's the word, nice and loud?
March.
March. Can you tell her what it says?
Month.
Okay, March is a month. You think this is a big joke, huh? All right, you know that word?
Yes.
What's the word?
Country.
Country?
Yes.
What's it say, class?
Canada.
Canada's a country, okay. Good semantic error there. Okay, so you'd be real good with whole language, actually. So, did I say that on camera? Okay, do you know these two words?
I think so.
All right, say what they are. What are they?
Car and tree.
Car and tree. What does it say?
Cat and toad.
Cat and toad. Okay, thank you. You have a seat? So sorry. Okay, that illustrates the two basic challenges that we have with kids with dyslexia. Number one, accurately sounding out words, but number two, remembering the words. So what do? They don't remember the words. They use context. They use semantically appropriate words. Think about the ones that, I forgot your name already. Monica, you have a good memory, Monica. Okay, so I forgot Monica, she read these words, and each one of the words she read was the same length and started with the same letter as what the real word was, but she didn't get it right? So that's what we see, of course, in kids with dyslexia, is they either come up with one that, something that's way off, or they will come up with something that kind of looks like the word. Those are the two key things. And we've spent most of our time, whoops, I got that? Yeah, we've spent most of our time focusing on the first one, haven't we? And the second one, we just assume it just sort of happens or doesn't happen, but that's my focus today on how that works. So we're going to do a crash course on how that works, but I want to begin with our assumptions, because we have to recognize what some of our assumptions are about reading. Not necessarily everybody in this room. Some of these things you may think, some of these are things that others may think, and I think that some of these assumptions that are used in popular instruction actually foster the problem. I'm not going to say create the problem, but they kind of foster the problem. You got to ask yourself, what's your theory about how you remember words, how we remember words? How does that happen? You're saying, well, I don't have a theory. Well, you might. You probably do have a theory. It's implicit. In other words, you probably haven't thought it through very much. And you can figure out what your theory is by taking a look at how you instruct and what you recommend, depending on the position you happen to be in. Most approaches, as I said, focus on identifying new words. And both phonics and whole language share that. And phonics and whole language actually share the characteristic that neither of them directly address the issue of remembering the words we read. I know some of you people that are really into phonics, like, really? You're grouping us together with whole language, okay? But the reality is that that this is something that we need to attend to and hasn't been attended to. So the three cueing systems, as you know, it's been a major, major force in reading education now since starting in the 80s. It became all the rage in the 90s, and it continues. It keeps changing names, doesn't it? Went from whole language to literacy-based to now it's called balanced instruction. But you hear different things. Even the three cueing systems, the name of that gets changed to MSV. Just to kind of stay one ahead of people who finally figure out that maybe this isn't working. And I'm not kidding. You read Ken Goodman's 2005 essay, and he says, we have to keep this going, even if we have to keep changing the names. And so he was a big advocate of using the term balanced instruction for this approach, this three cueing systems approach. So it was based on some ideas in the 1960s that at the time were just as good as any other ideas. It just was a matter of looking at the science. And in fact, in the 1960s, we did not understand how we remember the words we read. That wasn't first thought up until Linnea Airy came up with an idea in the late 1970s, and I'll talk more about that later, and it's taken quite a long road for it to get to the point where now it's pretty much universally accepted among reading research about how we store words. But the key is, it's this humility thing, and I'm not trying to make a value judgment here, but humility says, hey, my idea might be wrong, and look at this data, I need to modify my idea. I could spend literally an hour telling you how my ideas have had to change over the years as I learn more and more information. But that hasn't been the case with the three queuing systems approach. It is virtually identical. Maybe the terms are different. Maybe it's portrayed in different kinds of books and, jazzed up that way, but the concepts are the same since the 1960s, and it's continuously affirmed as being valid. What do you hear? Well, adults that are skilled reader, or any skilled reader reads using three queuing systems simultaneously, blah, blah, blah. It's stated enough times that it starts to sound true. By the way, this is a real dumb question. I know it's a dumb question. Taking you back to kindergarten, how many senses do we have? 5? Well, not really. We don't have 5. We have at least 7. When I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about do-do-do-do-do. There's 6 sense. I'm not talking about that, okay? That's one of the dark sides of people don't realize that ESP, people don't realize this. I hate to be giving away it for some of you. That is, and we don't give away magic tricks, but this does bother me. ESP is actually people doing magic tricks, not identifying them as such. There's an area called mentalism, and some of us, I do that. I do mind reading type things, but I tell them it's an illusion of the mind, not illusion of the eye. I don't have any powers, but there are other people that make money off it not tell you that. But they're called psychics, okay? But anyway, so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about physical senses. You see, where did the 5 senses thing come from? It came from Aristotle. And we've heard it for centuries, so we just assume it's true. But like if I stand here with my eyes closed, which is really a risky thing with 3.5 hours of sleep, but if I stand here with my eyes closed, I don't fall over. Why is that? Because I have what's called a proprioceptive sense. I have sensory information coming up through my joints and bones and nerves to tell me about my balance. I didn't fall over because of vision, because my eyes were closed. It wasn't hearing, wasn't taste, wasn't touch. You see what I'm saying? And we've all had a stomach ache, right? We've all had pain in a throbbing knee. How did you know? It's not your tactile sense, it's deep sensation. So we have at least 7 senses, and yet everybody just assumes it's 5 senses. In the same way, it keeps getting reaffirmed. Skilled readers read based upon using 3 queuing systems. You hear it enough times, it almost sounds like it makes sense. Well, let's take a closer look. As it turns out, skilled readers do not use context to identify words, only if it's a word they don't know. They might use context, they might use phonic decoding, they might use set for variability, which I'll describe. It turns out that it's children who struggle in reading heavily use context. Now, one of the geeky characteristics that I have is I read classical Greek. And I have to rely a lot on context, because I only read classical Greek in texts where I know that there's an English translation that I can cheat and look over at. And so if you kind of know what's going on, you can use context, because I'm basically dyslexic for classical Greek, okay? Because I pour, word-level reading of classical Greek. So people that, and you don't need, there are tons of studies on this, but you don't even need a study. Hand any skilled reader, I don't care if they're 2nd grade, I don't care if they're 12th grade, hand them a list of words that are obviously age appropriate, a list, no context, they rattle those words off instantaneously, don't they? The only words that skilled readers need to identify, other than unfamiliar words, the only familiar words that skilled readers need context for are what we call homographs, meaning the same writing. So like dove and dove, lead and led. And there aren't that many of those. And so we don't build a whole theory around just a small subset of less than 1/2 of 1% of words. So no, skilled readers do not use context when they identify words. In fact, they've done so many studies on this. They do what are called garden path experiments. Now, what's a garden path? All right, I used a garden path joke earlier today, right? I talked about my graduation level. So it's leading you down the garden path to think that this guy is an obnoxious braggart because he graduated, top 10 out of 850 students. And then, ta-da, that's the garden path experiment, garden path joke. That's a garden path joke. So in a similar way, what they would do is they would have students, and these are skilled readers, they would have them read a paragraph that's leading them to assume that by the time they get to the end, there's a certain big word that they anticipate, and they exchange a different word that looks just like it, except by 1 letter. And guess what? 95% of skilled readers kicks it out instantly. No, They don't get fooled by it. Now, based on this idea, yeah, they would read it the wrong way. They'd use context. So poor readers know fewer words, so they have to rely on context. If words aren't jumping out at you and you can't sound them out, you have to use context. Grammatical, syntactic. Now, by the way, context and grammar and syntax are essential for comprehension. Essential. You can't, okay, what does the word, rose mean? What does the word match mean? What does the word ring mean? No idea till it's in a context. But you can read the word rose instantly, or match, or any of those words instantly without context. So those are two different things. So we're talking about word level reading. The correlation between grammar and syntax and word level reading is close to zero. So here, one of the three cueings in the three cueing systems doesn't even correlate with word level reading. Graphophonic, now here's what's interesting. Skilled readers effectively sound out unfamiliar words. Once you get past those Dolch words, you all know what the Dolch words are? Okay, so Dolch words are the 220 or 320 most common words, depending on if you include the nouns or not. I actually have the original Dolch article from 1935. In our college has been around since the mid-1800s. And so I went to that part of the library, and they had those journals from that era. I look at it, I felt like I was in Hogwarts library, And I pull the book out and and I open up and make a copy, and I have it. And so I have that. Well, so what are the Dolch words? The Dolch are the words that are most common, that are used constantly. Is, it, the, and, all the prepositions, etc. About half of those, not quite, almost half of those are phonically irregular. It's a mess, isn't it? And so that's what people focus on. But once you get out beyond the Dolch words, the regularity of the language goes up quite a bit. And as it turns out, now, by the way, if any of you advocate phonics, how many of you advocate the idea of don't ever use context if a kid gets stuck on a word? How many of you advocate that? Nobody. But those that promote this type of view say they create what's called a straw man argument. A straw man argument is when you misrepresent the other side. That's that political thinking. You misrepresent the other side to make it easy to knock down. So they're arguing a point that nobody's arguing, right? So yeah, you can use context as a backup, but that's not how this system works. Context is primary, and graphophonic cues, or basic phonics sounding out, is the backup, and only used when necessary. But the problem is we can get an 80% accuracy rate between sounding it out and set for variability. Now, if you don't know what that term is, I'm going to tell you, you know what the concept is. You just didn't know the researchers had a name for it. Set for variability refers to the ability to correctly identify a mispronounced word. We do that all the time if we talk to somebody from, whose English is their second language, and some of the words they don't pronounce correctly, etc. My wife and I lived in Boston for 2 years when I was in one of my degree programs, and I had to learn. I do set for variability in the Boston area. In fact, I had a tour before. A guy took me around the campus, and he's telling me all the different professors and all the classes. I wanted to know what were the good classes, and he's telling me all the hot ones, right? And I'm like, oh, yeah, tell me, I want to know the hot classes, right? I'm going to be a first semester person. I might get closed out of those hot classes, right? But the problem was, see, I didn't have the set for variability for that particular word. See, he was saying H-A-R-D, a hot class. It's pretty hot, So I didn't have adequate set for variability for that. But in reading, what happens? We've all seen that kid that says, island. Like, whoa, where'd that come from, right? How many of you have ever had that happen? Yeah, they do it all the time. That's called set for variability. It's been studied. And one of the things that we realize is kids with higher vocabulary are better at set for variability, which kids with lower vocabulary are not quite as good at that. Which makes sense, because think about it. You're kind of trying to fish around. Even though it doesn't seem close, you have more to choose from. That's likely to be accurate. So we now know that guessing from context has about a 25% accuracy rate. One researcher who was favorable to this particular view, he felt that these studies were biased, so he did a study himself, and he found that the accuracy rate was about 33%. Compare that to 80. So it's very inefficient. So that's not how skilled readers read. All right, how many of you are familiar with this, right? Who wants to read it? Can you read that for me? Nice and loud. Nice and loud. I know. She's not going to sit in the front ever again. Nice and loud. Read it real. Go ahead.
There's a bogus email floating around
Louder.
the internet which claims we only need to notice the first and last letter of a word in order to identify it. It assumes that we don't pay attention to every letter of every word we read.
Thought you were done, huh? Go ahead.
That information is false, but the email is a demonstration of contextual facilitation, which is a type of tells us nothing about normal word recognition. By the way, people can't figure out most of these scrambled words when they are out of context.
Okay, how many of you have gotten an email like that? It says a Cambridge University study said, okay? You know, it's interesting. Cambridge University has a web page debunking that. Okay, they're like, we did not send that out. I think Ken Goodman did. All right, anyway. So I hate to be the one to tell you this. This is the kind of thing really your parents should tell you. But not every email forward is on the level. Now, actually, there is some truth. This is my version. I made this up. But there is some truth to this in terms of identifying. There's a difference between identification and recognition. You can identify a word without recognizing it. So you could identify, like if someone were to, okay, she's up front here. Let's say if someone needed to get a message to you from outside, they wrote down and they describe you, that person could walk in there and they don't know you. They could look around the room and they go, oh, there she is. They have enough information to identify you. That's identification. But recognition assumes past knowledge and past memory. So if your best friend walked in the room and said, oh, there she is, right? So recognition has to do with the words we already know, the sight vocabulary. Identification can include sight vocabulary. It's a broader term. It can include sight vocabulary, but it can also include words we sound out or guess from context. You've properly identified it. So there is some truth to it when it comes to identifying words, but it doesn't accurately represent how we recognize words. Remember I said we have about 40 to 60,000 words that we know instantaneously? I could flash any one of those words up on the screen for 1/20th. It's so fast. It flashes. Whenever I've done that in my lab, I've never done a study with it. I have the software, but a lot of studies have been done with this. I just haven't. But when you flash it on the screen, I get the same reaction from people, because I do it just for the fun sometimes. Laughter. They laugh. It starts out really easy. The word cat goes on the screen. And it's so fast, it's a flash of light, and people giggle. They go, cat? Like, did I just see cat? You know? And you're like, yeah, you saw a cat. And then it gets longer and longer, and the last one is like institution or something like that, and they get it. Everybody gets it. It's so fast, it's like a flash of light. That's okay. Now, I could do that with any one of the many of hundreds and hundreds of words that look just like another word and is off by one letter, and you'll still get it right. You can't do that without having processed. Now, not necessarily being aware. If you say people aren't aware of every letter of every word, no, we're not aware of practically any of the letters when we identify it. Awareness, we're past the awareness stage. This is automaticity. So this is not how normal reading works. If you have to rely on context, it's because there's what's called a degradation of the signal. There's different ways they do that. Some of you here don't know what I'm talking about. You're too young. But some of you more my age, you remember those 10th generation photocopies? Right? They came out of a typewriter originally, and you couldn't tell a C from an E because there was probably a chunk of dust on the E key, and filled in the top of that hole or whatever. And so what there was when you read certain words, you had to slow down and go, wait, that's what they call they degrade the signal. And they do many different studies how they do that in many ways. And what happens is when that happens, we have to use top-down processing. We have to kind of figure out from context. We have to piece things together. But bottom-up processing is how we normally recognize words. It's automatic without even thinking about it. I'll get back to that a little bit more later. All right. I need a quick helper. Who wants to help me with it? You want to help? You smile and laugh before you even had a chance. Come up here. No, I want you here because we couldn't even hear her. I think you get better embarrassment up here in front than you do when you're sitting there, okay? So it's right on the screen, and they can read along. But I want you to read those, what you're about to see. And this is reading by context. Nice and loud, they can all see. Ready? Also,
research shows that when readers read text, I was trying this earlier.
Oh, cheated.
But I couldn't get past it. Also, research shows that when
Any
readers
help,
read
class?
text with context.
Context, yes.
And without adequate letter level information,
You're good.
their accuracy drops to between 8 and 25%. There is therefore no reason to suspect that context provides as much help as the theories implies.
Thank you. All right. That's pretty good. I didn't get to embarrass her as much as I wanted, but yeah. Well, notice how you can get it as a group because everybody, you're getting different firings of our neurons and different people, and collectively you can get it, but it's a lot harder individually. Okay, so it's not just the issue with the three cueing systems. There's another very powerful set of assumptions that we make about reading that are based on very powerful intuitions. I look at that and I see a chair and I say chair. I look at the printed word chair and I say chair. Both involve visual input, both involve a phonological retrieval and verbal output. It feels the exact same to me. And it's very easy for us to think to teach that way. But as it turns out, input and storage are not the same thing. Once again, catering to those of us that are a little bit older, some of you younger ones, you don't know about this, but we used to have these things, maybe when you were kids, we used to have these things called telephone books. What's that? Yeah, I used it for a booster chair, exactly. Okay. So, telephone books, and what you would do is you would look up a phone number. I mean, think about that concept. Look up a phone number. Have any of you ever done that? Yeah, okay. No, you press the one on the screen and it goes into your phone app. All right, so what would happen is you would look at, that's visual input, right? And what's the output? Visual motor. So if we had really good visual memory, what would happen is we would burn into our brain the visual input of that number string and then transfer that over and transpose it, right? No, that's not what we do. What do? You translate it out of the visual realm entirely, 4632145, 4632145. You translate it into the phonological, and phonological back to visual. So what's my point? Now that's short-term memory or working memory. That's not long-term memory. Long-term memory is very similar in this respect, by the way. But the issue is input is not the same as storage. So the input was visual there, but the storage was phonological, wasn't it? So we can't confuse input and storage. As it turns out, we now know that storage of written words that assist us in word recognition is based on visual and orthographic and phonological and semantic information. James Cattell, published an article in 1886. And in that article, he was showing a new timing device that they could use for cognitive psychology experiments. He was able to measure with this new device reaction time to within 1/1000th of a second. That's a millisecond. You're going, really? 1886? But you just got to remember, 1880s, what was their big technology? Clocks, trains, that's it, okay? All right, so, and they also had something called a tachistoscope. A tachistoscope's not as sophisticated as this, but they were able to take a light and shine it on a screen and control how fast it was. And so they would flash a word on a screen. Immediately when it went on the screen, the timer started. And they had voice activation. I know it sounds pretty sophisticated for over 100 years ago, but they did. And he wrote about it. If you don't believe me, read the original article. Okay, I got it right out of Hogwarts Library. And what did he find? He found he had like 6 or 8 adults that he just said, here, sit down, we're going to try this. We're going to try out this new timing mechanism. He wasn't trying to study reading. He just wanted to test the mechanism. And he flashed words on the screen, and then he flashed pictures or drawings of those exact same things, like the word chair and a chair, the word dog and a dog, or things like that. Now, if you were doing that, if I was on the screen behind me and I heard a tone when the word went on there and watched you react to that, I couldn't tell the difference between if it was a picture of a dog or the written word dog. Both would be instant responses, correct? But when you get down to timing within 1/1000th of a second, he saw a consistent pattern. And the consistent pattern was that these individuals, and these were adult readers, recognized the printed word faster than the actual item. 1886, we had our first bit of evidence that there's a difference between visual memory for things, for objects, and what we now call orthographic memory. Then in the 1970s, they did lots of studies of dyslexia, and they found that dyslexics had they had the same bell curve for visual skills, all kinds of visual skills, the same. Now, that didn't shake our intuitions, unfortunately. I think what it did is it just fed into the mystique of dyslexia, because, the conclusion was more or less, dyslexics have good visual memory for everything except words. Right? Doesn't that kind of add to the mystique? Instead of saying, no, it's not about visual memory. So in the 1960s to 1980s, they did these they still do them today, mixed case experiments. So they present words in mixed case. The idea is we're throwing off any previous visual memory you have of that particular word. And what they did in the 1960s, they brought college students in, and they saw that the reaction time to mixed case words was slower than to words printed the normal way. They all patted themselves on the back. Everybody back then believed in the visual memory theory. And so they patted themselves on the back and said, see, we proved it. We disrupted their visual memory. They did worse. But then, interestingly, those people came back to the lab a few years later and redid those studies. Why? I don't know, but I have a theory. My theory is, have you ever gotten a wedding announcement or a graduation announcement in the mail, and it's got this really swirly print, right? You ever had that happen? And you look at it, and you're like, on the 14th of June, 14th of June, here, mark the calendar, right? And then you start reading it, and it's hard, isn't it? Because the print is so unusual. But by the time you read that little card that drops out that wants to know if you want New York strip steak or veal corn on blue, you know that little card? You can read it, and if you have to read it over again, it's easy. What's happened is your brain, in a sense, is adapted to that particular font. So my theory, I can never prove it, but those researchers, I think, got a few wedding invitations. And they said, you know what we didn't do in those studies is we didn't give an opportunity to actually see words that way before. It was too disruptive of the nature of the task. So they did more studies, and they brought students in, and they showed them maybe 200 words in mixed case and let them identify those words. Then they set those aside. They take a fresh batch of words they never saw before, so it equally disrupts their visual memory of those specific words. Their reaction time was identical to words printed the normal way. How do you explain that based on the visual memory theory? Now, when I first read about this theory, I can always remember when this was, because a couple months after I read about it, my son Kevin, who is 27 years old, he was 7 years old ending first grade, so that was 20 years ago. And I'm like a math whiz. Did you catch that? Okay. 3.5 hours of sleep, folks. I still did that. So Kevin, every night the kids read to us when they could read, and we read to them before that. And so I'm sitting on the bed next to Kevin. He's reading, every night we were doing the Berenstain Bear chapter books. And he was a very fluent reader at the end of second grade. And so we had borrowed that day, we had visited my brother-in-law, also named Dave, and we got some Calvin and Hobbes books for the kids. And my kids had never had any exposure to comic books ever. And so Kevin says, hey, Dad, can we read the Calvin and Hobbes books that we got from Uncle Dave? I thought the Calvin and Hobbes might be a good influence on the kids. So I said, sure. Kevin never read a comic strip, comic book, nothing like that. He read Calvin and Hobbes as quickly and fluently as he read words printed the normal way. Because these are in all caps. There's no way Kevin had remembered a visual memory of the all-cap version of all those words that he knew. They all jumped out at him anyway, even though they were in all caps. So you teach a kindergarten or first grader B-E-A-R in lowercase to the point where they know it and it jumps out at them. You present B-E-A-R in uppercase, and they'll get it instantly. They don't have to sound it out. And think about that. Every letter in that word, the lowercase and uppercase, are visually different. It's not like C, big C, little O, little o, that type of thing. They're different. They're visually different. It turns out we have an abstract representation of every word or letter that we recognize. It's drummed into us in pre-K, kindergarten, first grade. We develop an abstract. So within the first tenth of a second, when the first tenth of a second that we perceive a word, the actual look of the word gets stripped clean and starts heading to a part of our brain that can't deal with the look of the word anyway. And then it's only looking for a sequence, that sequence of letters. Is that a familiar sequence of letters? Yes, no. And by 2/10, 1/5 of a second to maybe 3/10, by that point, in our little storage bin called our left fusiform gyrus, which is an oversimplification, but it'll work for our purposes. Our brain is so interactive. Anytime you try to locate something to one spot, you oversimplify. And it looks in the storage bin and says, hey, do I got a positive ID or no? And if the answer is yes, we send information to our speech centers, and it activates, and we say the word. Or at least we think the word. I mean, what's interesting is our speech centers for production of speech are quite active when we do silent reading, just so you know that. So it's not the look of the word. It doesn't matter if it's uppercase, lowercase, mixed case. It doesn't matter what the font is, different people's handwriting. Now, Marilyn Jagger Adams, in one of her articles or books, she talked about how a study she did where she flashed words on a screen for a 20th of a second. As I said, it's a quick blur. And some of the words were uppercase, some were lowercase, and some were mixed case. After the study, she debriefed the students, which you always do anyway, and she explained what she did. And several of the students said to her, really? I didn't notice any uppercase words or didn't notice any mixed case words. And here's what's fascinating. A couple of the students debated with her and said, no, every word that flashed on that screen was lowercase. Why? Because that was too quick for us, for the any kind of visual memory we have, It already made it into the system. The letter sequence is what it was looking for, and they identified the word. So it's not visual memory. Also, if we think it's visual memory, we got to explain why it is that phonological skills correlate quite well with word reading, and yet visual skills do not. And when you take what's called the variance in a study of the general intelligence, you even lose that. You're down to 0. Notice how you block on people's names from time to time. You ever walk down the hall in your school and you see someone you have known for years, and they say, "Good morning, Dave," and you go, "Good morning." Darn. Right? We've all had that happen. Did you ever notice you never do that with words? When was the last time you seen a word you know for years? You go, "Oh, I know this. I'll get it." It's a different system. And it's not just people, it's things, right? We get block on things. At my dinner table, my kids know the routine, right? I'm looking right at it. I'm like, "Can you pass the, what do you want, Dad? Salt? Ketchup?" They know routine, napkin. What do you want? Right? You know how that works. So there's a visual memory failure. Now, if that bottle of ketchup was turned toward me, I would not have that confusion. I would not block. And by the way, not coming up with the name of the ketchup or not coming up with someone you see in the hallway, that's not even visual memory, folks. If you have more than one kid, you know what I'm about to say here, okay? All right? So I have 5 kids. Youngest is 21, and I got three grandkids. My wife and I, of course, we married when I was 7, she was 6. And the first 4 were boys. The last one was a girl. We called her Hallelujah. But by the time she was like 5, my wife and I voted her as most likely to spend time on Ritalin. But that never happened. All right. So anyway, so with the 4 boys, right? If Sean, who's the youngest of the 4, did something when he was little, you know the routine, right? Stephen, Kevin, Brennan, Sean, right? I'm trying to get to the. We're trying to get the name. That is not a visual memory failure, folks. That is a phonological retrieval failure. There's a big difference. And let me explain. If I looked at that kid doing something that I didn't like, and I said, "I've never seen that kid before in my life," that would be a visual memory failure. If you walk down the hall and you see somebody that you've known for years and you don't even recognize them, that's visual memory failure. Now, there's a reason I bring this up. First, to get a laugh. Second, it's very important because we have to recognize this in kids. They're looking at the letter T, and the kid's going, "Oh." You're going, "Oh, visual deficit." No, folks, that's not a visual deficit. That's a phonological retrieval failure. They have done studies of this. The visual skills needed to properly identify a letter are so basic. You put an L, as long as they understand the language, you put an L next to a T or a C next to an E to a 3 or 4-year-old that doesn't even know those, and as long as they understand the language of what same and different or whatever, they can tell the difference. They can distinguish them. Studies came out of Oxford University. One was, I think, 2013, one was 2014. First with typically developing kids, a whole lot of them. They taught them with a new alphabet that they made up. They pulled some Greek characters and Russian characters that didn't look like English characters, and they trained them on this. This says, the letter names, letter sounds that they trained them on. And what they found is in terms of the visual memory requirements for these kids, they did a bunch of visual tasks to test their visual memory for those unusual characters. The kid that was the strongest in the visual memory and the kid that was the weakest was like here. In the typically developing kids, the difference in the strongest in the phonology and the weakest in the phonology was here. That's where the variability and the variation occurred. That's where kids stumble, not in the visual realm. Then they repeated that same study with dyslexic kids. These kids were like, 3rd and 4th grade, but they taught them all over again letter-sound relationships. And the difference in the visual memory of those kids was just like this. The difference in the phonological memory was just like this. It's not visual memory. The visual memory required for letters is very easy. It's phonology. The phonological core deficit makes it hard for kids to properly access the phonology and get it right. So when a kid's look at a letter and gives the wrong sound, it's not visual. It's not visual, okay? Unless the child needs glasses. There were 2 cases. This is embarrassing. But day 1 of my first course in my school psychology program was before you do any evaluation, make sure the kid sees okay, all right? And so there were 2 kids. I'm like, man, this kid's struggling in reading, right? Come to find out they needed glasses, all right? It's pretty embarrassing. But the statute of limitations ran out of that. That was a long time ago, so I can It's not a problem. I can't be sued or anything like that. Okay, that was about 20 years ago. All right, so here's another thing to keep in mind. Students who are deaf. The average reading level of a student who graduates high school who's deaf is about third grade reading level. How do you explain that if reading is based on visual memory? The individuals who are deaf do not have an alternative visual memory type of way to learn to become a competent reader. So that shouldn't be a problem, whatever. And then since 2000, there have been many, many neuroimaging studies. They first discovered this activation of the left fusiform gyrus when we see familiar words back in 2000. That has taken off. Lots of funding for that because it's about $1,000 a person when you do a functional MRI. And dozens of studies in this area now. And we now know that the area that lights up when we see a chair and say chair, and the area that lights up when we see the word chair and say chair, they're different areas of the brain. Same phonological retrieval, but different area lights up in terms of recognition. So we have to get past this strongly intuitive notion that somehow reading is based on visual skills. It's not. Once the letter string is input, the vision has done its work, and that's within the first tenth of a second. Okay, here's some concerns about phonics. This might make people a little uncomfortable here, but here, let me tell you this, because I can't say this enough, and you'll see this particularly if, later today if you sit in. You will not become a proficient reader if you don't have phonics skills, period. There is no alternative way to deal with an alphabet-based language without letter sound skills and becoming proficient letter sound skills. However, with that said, we have to look at the history of how we've tried to deal with that. Now, a hammer worked just as well in the 1800s as it works today, doesn't it? And so just because the Orton-Gillingham, type of methods have been around since the 40s or whatever, and whatever, okay, so you'd say it worked just as good then as it does now. But look for a roofing company that uses hammers. They don't. They use nail guns. They fine-tuned it. They've revised it. They make it much more efficient. So we have to be willing to say, we're not saying do away with phonics because that would be disastrous. But what I am saying is there are things we need to take a long, hard look at because we've had a lot of research in the last 40 years that was not available when a lot of our phonic teaching methods were first brought up. So explicit and systematic phonics is obviously necessary. If you want to do a study of a method with phonics, you want to get good results, just put it up against a balanced instruction or whole language and you're going to get good results. But here's what's interesting. For most kids, the results wash out by about third or fourth grade. Why? The reason behind that is any competent reader, you take children who are in, say, fourth grade, who were never taught any explicit phonics in their classrooms at all, and they were never taught any phonemic awareness, they become good readers anyway. That's what happens to the top two-thirds. But you give those kids nonsense words, they get them instantly. What does that mean? That means they learn the phonics in spite of the fact that they weren't taught the phonics. You cannot read an alphabet-based language without phonics skills. But the kids in the bottom third don't figure it out all on their own. So in a sense, that top two-thirds taught themselves. They learned in spite of the method that they were taught. So the bottom third is not going to figure that out. They're not going to abstract that from the words they see. So they have to be taught explicitly and systematically. So the bottom third, when you do phonics instruction, it shows benefit over time. But the problem is we have way too many kids that are taught with a phonic approach that still don't catch up. Their fluency is weak, and they're not up to grade level. They're better off than they were before, for sure, but they don't seem to catch up. And then there's a small percentage of kids, that don't seem to be able to even benefit from phonics. They just can't. They're so severely reading disabled. Those are the kids I'm most interested in, by the way, and I'll be talking about that because we can move those kids forward. But like I've already said earlier, there is no built-in mechanism to traditional phonics instruction that allows kids to build a large sight vocabulary. That you know about. There actually is. And we want to kind of pop that open and see how that works. It's called the self-teaching hypothesis of David Scher. But without the adequate phonological and phonemic proficiency, we don't get the benefit of that. Okay, so let's say if you can look at kids, let's say if you can look at kids with, this could be your bottom, let's say your bottom 20%. Don't attach numbers to this. This is just a conceptual idea right here. So if you look at the bell curve, most of the curve is over here. You with me on that? So it's over here. I know I shouldn't, when their camera's over here, I shouldn't go like this, because then they're looking at my bald spot. So I'm sorry, let's do that again. Just cut. Yeah, so anyway, the curve is over here. And These just represent, let's say, the bottom 20%. Now, when it comes to phonological skills, because I'm going to talk about the connection with phonology and reading, the kids with the mildest phonological skills, more moderate phonological skills, and severe phonological skills. Look at the patterns we end up with. The kids with the mild phonological skills, those children, when you expose them to explicit systematic phonics, that is enough to stimulate their phonemic skills, or phonemic awareness skills, which will become clear in the next couple screens, to allow them to now become good at remembering the words they read. Because as it turns out, as much as this is contrary to our intuitions, phonemic awareness skills, or actually phonemic proficiency more precisely, is essential for sight word vocabulary. And then remember, we got to move away from this visual memory model, because the problem with phonemic awareness has been, wait a minute, why are we doing this auditory training when reading is visual? It's so against our intuitions. But we now understand how the process works. So the kids with the mildest problems, those kids, the explicit letter sound activated, the phonemic awareness they need, they go on, live happily ever after, they end up making grade level, they are great, and guess what? Those are the ones that go on all the websites promoting the programs, right? Aren't you going to take those kids and say, hey, look at this kid, he's now 6th grade reading at a 7th grade level, and he was at a 3rd grade level 6 months ago, right? Wasn't properly taught, had the phonological core deficit, but had a mild version of it. Now, the moderate situation, those kids, not quite so much. Those children are taught explicit systematic phonics, and they become much better at phonics. And their nonsense word reading goes up, which means they're getting better at phonics. Nonsense word reading is our best test of phonic abilities that we have. And so those kids go up, but their real word reading doesn't go up that well, and their fluency is still problematic. Then you get to the most severe kids with the most severe phonological core deficit, and those kids don't even seem to benefit from phonics. You can stand on your head, they don't even seem to get it. Like a boy, Stephen, I'll call him. He was one of the first kids I tested in phonological awareness. He had 106 IQ. That translates into 66th percentile. 6th grader, quote unquote, smarter than 2/3 of kids his age, and he was reading at a 1st grade reading level. He had been through every phonic program under the sun. And I did a phonological awareness test on him, and it was like, say baseball, baseball. Now say it again, but don't say base. Like, what do you mean? Now keep in mind, that's a late preschool, early kindergarten task. You do that to a late preschool or early kindergartner, they do it instantly. Well, if you say baseball and don't say base, you get ball. Oh, okay. I mean, this is a bright kid, 6th grader. All right, say sailboat, sailboat. Now say it again, but don't say sail. Boat, he got it right, head tipped side to side, face cringed, he's mouthing it as he's doing this. This is a child with severe phonological core deficit. This is a child we're teaching, he can't even do sailboat, right? So those kids don't benefit from phonics because they don't have the phonological awareness skills to benefit from phonics. It's that severe. So here's the problem with both balanced instruction and phonics. Take a look at this. So neither whole language nor phonics gets explicit with step 2. My whole reading into this reading research now for the last 20 years has been step 2. What's step 2? How do they actually remember the words? How do they go from being using our instructional methods to, oh, apparently people are following along here on the pages, huh? Yeah, it's like the hymnal in church, okay? All right. So, no, the words are up on the screen now. That's so annoying. All right, anyway. So, crash course on how are words learned. Alphabetic principle. You could have two people, like the two of you could be from different parts of China. And you could be from Hong Kong and you speak what, here in the West, you're sitting here going, he's not going to call me up, is he? Okay. You could be from Hong Kong and you speak what's called Cantonese. We call it in the West Cantonese. They call it Chinese there. And you could be from mainland China and speak, she doesn't even want to make eye contact. And she speaks Mandarin, what we call Mandarin. They're both called Chinese in China, which is kind of interesting. It'd be like us calling Spanish and English. Okay, but it works for them, so who am I to criticize? So anyway, the two of you could not talk to each other. They're different languages, but the two of you could read the same newspaper at the same time. Think about that for a minute. How could that be? The reason is that those words on the page are not keyed into the pronunciation of your oral language. See, you have a word tree, and your word tree is different than your word tree, I know, it's not polite to point. And the, folks, I had 3.5 hours of sleep, okay? The filter's gone. Now, there's a character there that represents tree, but you say your oral word tree, and you say your oral word tree. And in fact, in English, if you knew what the character was, you could say the English word tree. But alphabet writing is different. We don't write words. We talk about writing words. We don't write words. We write characters that represent phonemes. It's very different. And the alphabet, look it up. The alphabet was invented once. Writing was invented many times. You had the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you had Chinese, you had the cuneiform, etc. But alphabetic writing was invented once in what is now modern Syria, in about 1700 BC. And all of the alphabets that we have in the world are all, you don't believe, it sounds strange because they all look so different. Look at it. The linguists trace it back. In fact, we have 2 modern derivatives, but they're pretty old, modern derivatives from the original alphabet, and that's Hebrew and Arabic. And thankfully, the Greeks, the Hebrew and Arabic don't represent the vowels with characters. I have to modify that a little bit, but for the most part, they don't represent the vowels with characters. And thankfully, the Greeks, when they took the Phoenician alphabet over, they added vowels, which was cool, okay? But then all the others derived from that. We have the Roman alphabet was based on the Greek alphabet. They didn't like it, so they changed the characters a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. So we write sequences of phoneme-based characters. And what that means is if you have a problem with dealing with the phonemic aspects of language, you're going to struggle on every level of word reading, whether it's sounding out words, but also attaching those strings of letters to the pronunciation so that they jump out at us. And I just said that, didn't I? So that affects both. And the part that we've been missing, and I'm going to skip on because you have this in your handout, the part that we've been missing is dealing with how that phonemic nature allows us to remember words as whole units, so they jump out at us. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this because there's so much out there on this, but the simple view of reading, I just want to put what I'm saying in a proper context. The simple view of reading, many of you have heard of that. It basically says reading comprehension is based upon 2 very broad skills. One is your word level reading, and the other is your ability to comprehend the language in which that is written. So if you understand the oral language that something is written in, and you can read the words quite fluently and effortlessly, you will comprehend what you read. And that has been studied over and over and over again in many languages with many kids, many special populations of individuals, and it holds true very well. So what we're going to focus on is the word level reading. And the 2 aspects, again, are sounding out new words that you don't know, but remembering the words that you read. All right, I kind of said all this, and you can see that, so I'm going to kind of skip through so I can get to some of the good stuff. Oh, rapid naming. You saw rapid automatized naming on that list. And I didn't talk much about it, but I want to do a quick demonstration of rapid automatized naming. Oh, yeah, sorry, I do want to get this. The clicker went too quick. So what the simple view of reading does is it allows us to see 3 to 4 different patterns of struggling readers. One is dyslexia. So dyslexia means that the word reading is poor, but the language comprehension is okay. Then you have the hyperlexic, which I mentioned earlier. The hyperlexic, the word reading is fine, but the language comprehension is problematic. And most of our kids where English is a second language, that is an issue for them. And what you'll see is that they'll get up to speed on the word reading much more quickly than they will in the comprehension because they need to be around a lot longer exposed to English and to build their vocabulary and their background knowledge, et cetera. And then you have the mixed type, which is the most challenging for we teachers. And the mixed type or combined type, the original term for that was the garden variety poor reader. I didn't make that up, okay? The garden variety poor reader. So the mixed or combined type means that you have characteristics of both dyslexia and hyperlexia. So you have both language problems and word reading problems. Interestingly, the easiest of those to deal with is the word reading, once we understand the mechanisms behind it and how it works. But there's also another one that I've called some attention to, and I think it's important to pay attention to, is the compensator. The compensator is the child who usually is very bright, probably in the top third in terms of verbal adeptness. Those would be kids who on their IQ test get like a 105 or higher, and that's the top third. Or 106, technically 106 and higher is the top third. And those children may have mild phonological issues. But guess what? When they do word reading tests, they have the advantage of set for variability that a kid with, say, okay, let's say you have a child with 113 verbal IQ. You have another kid with a 90 verbal IQ. That's at the 25th percentile. Both of them do 2 word reading tasks off, say, the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test revised. It's one of the most popular tests that's been out there for years. And the word identification, it's untimed. Let's just say that these two, the person with a 113, the person with a 90 IQ, both of them already know the same words when they go into this test. They just so happen to have the same words that are instantly familiar to them. Well, they also, let's say they have the same phonic decoding skill. So in the word identification task, they go through and they say the words they already know. Then they get to the words they don't know, and they use their weak phonic decoding, and let's say the kid with the 90 gets 2 or 3 more correct. And he doesn't have very good set for variability, so that's it. And he ends up getting an 85 on the real word reading. But the other child indicates the words he already knows, can only sound out 2 more words with his weak phonics skills, but with his weak phonics skills and his set for variability because he's brighter, he gets 5 or 6 more items, and he pulls a 93. And so we're like, well, that kid's in the average range. The other kid's 85. He's a standard deviation below. Their reading's equivalent, folks. But the compensator we miss because the compensator came up with the right items. One solution to that, at least at the elementary level, is use a test like the test of word reading efficiency. 2 tests that I strongly recommend. The CTOP, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, if you're a school psychologist, reading teacher, if you're a resource teacher or another teacher that does individual assessment, and then the test of word reading efficiency. Out of Florida State, by the way, you already paid for this in your tax dollars. All the research that went into that, the years, and went into publications and scientific articles before they got to the final version, all the field testing. I just want to do my disclaimer with the what do they call it? Can I repeat it? I said I want to do my disclaimer. It's the CTOP, Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, and then the Test of Word Reading Efficiency, both in their 2nd edition. So, the financial interest. I have no financial interest, but I wish I did. Okay, because I recommend it all the time. It totally revolutionized my career as a practicing school psychologist because I went back to the table and had sensible stuff to say. So on the test of word reading efficiency, you have, this works not quite as good at the middle school and high school for reasons I can't get into right now, but at the elementary school, it's great because your kids got 45 seconds to read words. They start easy and they get harder and harder and harder. That looks at your sight, the size of your sight vocabulary. If you are a compensator, you can't compensate your way through that task. Because if you slow down to sound it out and you set for variability, the clock is ticking and you get fewer items correct. So all of our classic word identification tasks are naturally confounded between words that you already know and words you're able to figure out on the spot. And kids with higher IQs that are compensators can figure out more words on the spot because of set for variability in their vocabulary skills. You with me on that? So what happens is the compensators slide by and we don't really realize. We might identify the compensators because their spelling is really poor or just their general writing is poor. I found some compensators because they were down in the office for behavior problems. And so there's some of our best and brightest kids who could be doing much better, and they have poor phonology. I test their phonological awareness skills, and it's lousy. Okay, so we have to be aware of that. One quick story about a compensator. This spring, I did a presentation in a local school district, and a teacher came up to me and said, we had this one girl come in the kindergarten. Her mom was a physician, dad an attorney, both great readers, put a lot of emphasis on reading. She read all kinds of stuff. The parents did all the right things. Comes into kindergarten, she's reading to all the other kids. 119 IQ, they figured out, by the way, later on down the line. And by 1st grade, even though she was like the top kid across all the classrooms in that school in kindergarten, by 1st grade, she was middle of the pack. By 2nd grade, she was the bottom one in her class, but not necessarily the bottom one across all the 2nd grades. By 3rd grade, she was the lowest reader in 3rd grade that didn't have some sort of special education designation with 119 IQ. So they gave her the phonological awareness screening test, which I don't know if we talked about that, Lynn, or not, but we'll make that available. It's free. And they did that with her, and they started with her. Remember Steve I told you about? Steve and this girl, I've never heard of what I'm about to tell you and what I just told you with Steve in literally thousands of kids I've given this to. And they said to her, say baseball, but don't say base. She couldn't do it. She couldn't do a preschool level phonological, and she's in 3rd grade. Now, what I told you about Steve, what I told you about this girl, extreme. And so that's a compensator. And so when did we maybe identify her? Maybe at the earliest would have been 2nd grade, but more likely 3rd when she got to the bottom. So compensators we need to pay attention to. And if we do good Tier 1 work, most of those will eliminate that problem, but that'll be something for another time that we'll talk about later. Okay, so here's the rapid naming. I want you to name these colors as fast. I'm sorry they're printed words. Just ignore the printed words. Just name the colors as fast as you can, starting in the upper left, which is obviously yellow. Go. Rapid naming, folks. All right. Well, see, the reason I use colors, because we use colors when we work with kids. We don't know that they've mastered the letters and sounds, so kindergarten, beginning first, we use colors, little boxes of color. When I do it with kindergartners, they go a lot faster than that. But maybe it's the projection, the way the colors are up there. I'll tell you what, I'll make it easier. The other thing we do is rapid object naming for kids that haven't mastered their letters and numbers. So these are objects, all of them. They're simple, you'll pick up on them easy. I took it from this article here. And there's only 12. Do all 12 as fast as you can, okay? Oh, I forgot to tell you. In this article, unfortunately, these were great little items, but they put words like either on them or next to them. Just ignore the words. I only want you to read the name the items as fast as you can, starting upper left. Go. Quickly. Okay. Some of you still aren't done? All right. Once again, the kindergartners really, you kind of got toasted by them. All right. So let me ask you this. Did you put any mental effort into reading the word triangle or suitcase or any other words up there? Did you put mental effort into that? No. You put mental effort into not saying it. That is sight word vocabulary. Those are words in your orthographic lexicon. If they're in your orthographic lexicon, we are not capable. This is tough because it's double negatives. We are not capable of not reading them. The only way you could not read those words is to close your eyes. Effortless. There's no effort. When you hear the word effortless, you go, well, there's got to be some effort. No, there was no effort. The only effort you put in was to not say those. That is what word recognition is all about. And that's what good readers do quite naturally. They develop and they anchor those words in long-term memory by a process called orthographic mapping that I'll get to. Let me introduce to you David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis. What David Scher has pointed out, actually his mentor pointed out before that, and he's just developed it, is we teach ourselves most of the words we know. If you know 40,000 words instantly, did your parents teach you all 40,000 of those words? No, maybe a few hundred at the most that we actually were taught directly. We learn those words, folks, through phonic decoding. We learn those words by sounding out those words in context. Silent reading, study after study after study has shown that to be the case. So orthographic learning is implicit. In other words, we're not consciously making the connections between pronunciations and letter strings. It just happens kind of behind the scenes. So as students take the time to work through the sounds and sound that out, behind the scenes, as I'll explain momentarily, we're making the connections between that pronunciation and that letter string so that that letter string becomes so familiar it jumps out at us instantly. And what David Scher's research has shown, and actually people before him showed this, but a lot of people, when they do this kind of study, they put it in the context of his theory, is that children from second grade on only require 1 to 4 exposures to new words, and then it's part of their permanent sight vocabulary. You're like, not the kids I work with. But think about it. Kids enter first grade from kindergarten, and they know maybe a couple hundred words. 2 years later, they enter third grade, and they know several thousand words. Do the math. They didn't have the time to see each word 20, 30 times. Just 1 to 4 exposures for typical. So that's one of the keys, by the way, for dyslexia early on. When kids take from second grade on, if kids take many, many exposures to learn a word, that's a clear sign that they're not adding the words to their sight vocabulary. That's a clear sign of dyslexia. Let's see. Yep. All right, orthographic mapping is the mental process we use to store unfamiliar words and make them familiar words. Again, I'm going to go through this quickly because you have this. Here are the skills you need for orthographic mapping. You need to have letter sound proficiency. You need to have phonemic proficiency. This is where all this phonemic stuff comes in. Letter sound proficiency is this. Kids at the end of first grade, when you show them a CVC nonsense word, they'll say it instantly. You show them MIP, they're going to say MIP, as if it was a real word. Now, if you do millisecond timing, you will notice that it's slower, but nothing we can catch. They look at it and they say MIP, just as if it was a real word. And when I say slower, it's slower than a real word. But think about what had to happen. That child had to retrieve the sound for the M, retrieve the sound for the I, retrieve the sound for the P, and then blend them all together all in under 1 second. So my question is this. Did that child conscientiously, the key word is conscious, did that child consciously or conscientiously search to find the sound that went with the M or the I or the P? No. It was instant. It was automatic. Proficient is the term I use. So letter sound proficiency. Now, if you give that same ending first grader splank, that's going to slow them right down. They're going to splank. It's going to be like that. But you give an ending second grader splank, they say splank. What that means is their letter sound proficiency grew. So let's take that letter sound proficiency and add to it phonemic proficiency. So you start, a good phonological awareness task starts out easy. Say baseball, but don't say base, etc. Then you get to, say cat and change the k to a pat. Then you get to a harder item, some more difficult items. And you say to the child, say fly, fly. Now say it again, but instead of a little say rur, fry. Children at the end of second grade into third grade that are skilled readers, even if they were never taught that kind of task, never even taught phonics, and they're good readers, if they're good readers, that's how quickly they will respond. Now, I want you to stop and think about what they have to do. And I know that because not only have I tested probably done over 1,000 evaluations on kids that struggle in reading, I've tested over 1,000 kids that are typical readers in the data gathering and the studies that I've done. So I have exposure to both. And they do. They'll respond instantly to that. So think about what the child had to do to accomplish that. First of all, I'll tell you what they did. They did 4 classic phonological awareness tasks all in under 1 second. So they see the word, or they hear the word fly, and they change the little to r. I'm not sure which direction I went with that, but so they have fly. First thing they have to do is they have to pull fly apart. That's called segmentation. The second thing they did is they did what's called phoneme isolation. The CTOP has a phoneme isolation test now. And they had to go, where am I hearing the l? Beginning, middle, and end. Oh, there it is, right in the middle. That's isolation. Where am I hearing that sound in that word? Then you do what's called phoneme manipulation. I took out the l and put in a r. Then they did phoneme blending. They blended what was left over, and now it's fry, all in under a second. So my contention is that child did not put any mental energy, any effort, any conscious attention to segmenting the word fly. Fly was segmented automatically for that child behind the scenes the minute the child heard the word, and they're not looking at the letters. So this is how it works. Let's say if my fist represents a phonological memory of the word stand. And if somebody says stand, that activates. Now, if I sound it out, I see it for the first time and I go st and, oh, stand. I've just brought that from the printed realm into the oral realm. And I've done nothing differently than as if somebody said it. Stand. It still activates it. So so I'm going from letter sounds to oral pronunciation, letter sounds to oral pronunciation. But how do I make it so that this particular pronunciation is attached to this? How does that work? That's what orthographic mapping explains. So let's say I have good phoneme awareness or phoneme skills. When I hear the word stand, I can pull those sounds apart. This is what's in my memory system. So now this is what's anchored. This is what I want to anchor that letter string to. And I have, in a sense, the suction cups to attach to those letters. Stand. So I'm taking what I already know and attaching it to what I'm trying to learn. And as a result, because I'm attaching it to something I already know, this specific sequence becomes very familiar because it attaches to this specific sequence of phonemes. And after 1 to 4 exposures, I now treat this as a unit because it's a familiar unit to me. Now it goes from an area in my brain which is higher up in my temporal lobes and kind of overlapping a little bit with occipital lobes. When we see words we don't know, we sound them out. And they have to go through that first. We have plenty of evidence to show they have to go through that first before they end up in the fusiform gyrus. Now, as it turns out, dyslexics do add words to their sight vocabulary. And they do it through orthographic mapping, but they do it highly inefficiently. So their sight vocabulary grows like this. Everybody else, it's growing like that. So because they do not have the phonemic proficiency, it takes so many exposures before they attach the sounds in the word to that sequence. Maybe dozens. We don't even know. The only 2 studies I know of one stopped after like 16 and one stopped after 14 or 18, I can't remember. They still didn't get it. But yet, these were 4th and 5th graders, but yet the 1st and 2nd graders got it in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 exposures. So because they can't instantly pull that apart, they have no way of connecting this pronunciation to that letter string. Now notice how I'm going in the opposite direction of phonics. In phonics, we go from text to brain, but with orthographic mapping. Now orthographic mapping goes both ways. It's interactive. That's what how David Scher, this is Linnea Airy developed this, and they integrate very nicely that way. But it's really both ways. But the idea is once those letters and sounds are in my working memory, then without even thinking about it, that's why it's implicit, folks, because neither of their theories can explain why we don't remember attaching it. Both of their theories have tons of research to show that that's actually what's going on. But none of them neither of them explain why it's behind the scenes. And we now know it's because the proficiency of pulling apart those words, if you have the phonemic skills, is automatic and behind the scenes. That's why we don't remember it. We attach it to the pronunciation. So that's how we remember the words we read. And we just need to remember where we put the remote. All right, so anybody see where I set that down? Hidden. All right. So it turns out we map word parts, by the way. We map rhymes, we map blends. IP, by the way, is in your orthographic memory. And it's in your phonological memory. Because you may not have ever processed the word IP conscientiously, but it's in your phonological memory. Because it's part of SIP and DIP and CHIP and LIP. And I like IP because there are 20 single-syllable words with IP. How do I know? Did I read that in a book? No, I sat down and went through every single possible combination and permutation. I'm a boring guy. So what I'm saying is those, they did studies with like fourth graders, skilled fourth graders. They do nonsense words like NALK. And now strong second graders, and they had fourth graders, and they said knock instantly. Why? Because ALK, they know it from chalk and talk and walk. But weaker second graders said NALK, using kind of a phonic decoding approach, right? So what happens is we store sequences as if they're words. And I could go into that in much more detail. I've done some studies with that, and other studies are done long before me. And we map, affixes or prefixes and suffixes. A lot of research support for that. Okay, that's all the stuff I won't be able to tell you. All right. But it's important to understand the difference between phonemic awareness and phonemic proficiency. Phonemic awareness, think of that word awareness. Define the word conscious without using the word awareness. It's really hard. And so we keep talking about awareness of phonemes. I'm saying no, it's not being aware of phonemes. It's more than that. Because there are children, especially some of these compensators, they will get, if you say fly and change the little to rur, they're going to get that right, but it's going to take 4 seconds. And they're going to spell that in their head, and they're going to swap it out, and they're going to read back what's left. So phoneme awareness is not the same as phoneme proficiency. And here's what's interesting. What kids need to be able to do in the phonological realm is segment. You go, well, Dave, let's just do a segmentation task. No, it doesn't work. And I'll tell you why. Because if I say to a child, tell me all the sounds you hear in stand, they go, st, nt. Is that conscious or unconscious? It's conscious. I just asked them to do it. So you have no way of knowing if their ability to segment a word is automatic and unconscious from a segmentation task. And that's one of the reasons why segmentation tasks drop off the map after first grade, because they don't correlate that well with reading after first grade. That's why Dibbles, AimsWeb, Easy CBM pull them off. But manipulation tasks have been shown to continue to correlate right on up through adulthood. Because when you do a manipulation task, particularly if your response is quick, that is letting you know. Now, if a child does a manipulation task instantly, you know the segmentation is automatic. So we can't get at automatic segmentation by segmentation tasks. We only get at automatic segmentation by manipulation tasks. And that's why we promote that. And by the way, that's almost all we see now in the last 5 to 10 years in reading research. You don't see segmentation tasks used for phonemic awareness. You don't see blending. You don't see rhyming. You don't see that stuff. It's almost all manipulation tasks. Most commonly deletion, but also substitution. So we have to think proficiency has to do with unconscious access. All right. Common misunderstandings. I'm not going to go through these. They're pretty, should be pretty clear. They're in your handout. But I want to spend my last couple of minutes, 4 minutes or so, explaining this. If there's such a thing as tattooing something in your brain, I would like this to be tattooed in your brain. It's tattooed in my brain. This helps organize, and this is going to be my last slide. I know there's other stuff after this. But this helps us, this makes sense of so many different things. We've been focusing all our attention on the right side of this scenario here. Kids come into kindergarten, they have letter name, letter sound knowledge, and we know that letter name and letter sound knowledge predicts later reading. It's a very good indicator. And there's a reason for that that goes deeper than just the fact that you need letters to sound out words. You need letter sounds to sound out words. That's part of it. So that intuitive element is absolutely part of it. But there's more to it than that. You see, we now know that kids that pick up on letter name and letter sound knowledge more quickly than those that don't are the kids that have better early phonological skills than those that don't. How do we know? There's 2 ways. We know there's a causal relationship. You can draw a causal arrow. You see, the causal relationship between reading and phoneme awareness is, you'll see, interactive. It goes both ways. So not both ways on the same level, but you'll see how this works. So there's a causal arrow. I don't have enough sophistication to do the arrows in PowerPoint, I'm sorry. There's a causal relationship from early phonological awareness, like alliteration, clapping out syllables, etc. How do we know that? Well, number one, you take data when the kids are 3 years old and don't know any letter names and letter sounds and their phonological skills, and that predicts how quickly you pick up on it. But that's not even the strongest data. The strongest data is when you take a bunch of 3-year-olds and even 4-year-olds that don't know any letter names and letter sounds, you divide them into 2 groups. One group gets early phonological training. The other gets extra vocabulary training. And guess what? The ones that got the extra phonological training pick up on their letter name and letter sound knowledge much more quickly. That's causal. So we now know, why do kids come in to kindergarten with higher or lower phonological skills? Well, the only answer we had in the past is what the parents did at home. And yes, folks, that's a part of it. That is a big part of it. But you may have had parents that did all the right things, and the kids are still coming in with 13 uppercase, 6 lowercase, and the only sound they know is at the beginning of their name. And the parents said everything right. So the other thing about why letter name and letter sound knowledge in kindergarten is so powerful is not just because letter sounds are important for reading, but it's an indicator of the phonological core deficit that early. And then if you focus on letter sounds for long enough, oh doesn't mean anything. You focus on things like oh and and you do that long enough, that develops phoneme awareness in most kids. For typically developing kids, just focusing on letter sounds is the cause of phoneme awareness. Phoneme awareness does not naturally develop in human speech. So years ago in China, when they would test adults, Chinese adults who were perfectly competent readers, they couldn't do simple phoneme awareness that our first graders and second graders could do. They don't need to, because their language doesn't require them to break the language down into individual phonemes. You can't do that in China anymore because they do pinyin, which is using the Roman alphabet. They teach that early on and then transition. So now Chinese adults, they've been trained in an alphabet language and they can do phoneme awareness. So what happens is phoneme awareness is a byproduct of being taught letter sounds. Then phoneme awareness and the segmentation and blending allows us to do phonic decoding and basic spelling. Think about it. What's phonic decoding other than 2 things? The ability to identify the letters and blend them together. So now you draw your causal, on both sides you're drawing your causal arrows down, but also across. And so you do phonic decoding and basic spelling a lot throughout first and second grade, and you become really proficient at it, so then all that stuff becomes automatic. You develop automatic letter sound skills, like I described, and you develop automatic phoneme proficiency. And as a result, you have those advanced phonological or phonemic awareness skills. You become much more adept at connecting behind the scenes, without even thinking about it, connecting those pronunciations to those spelling patterns, so that those spelling patterns become so familiar, they activate instantly. That's how it works. Kids with dyslexia, they do not naturally develop the phonological skills as a result of instruction. They have to be taught. Now, maybe they'll develop the basic phoneme skills of segmentation and blending by the end of second or third. Some do. The kids with the milder and moderate will do that anyway. But advanced phonemic awareness will never develop in those moderate to severe kids, ever, 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 without instruction. And so what happens is, you want kids to do better over here on the right, we need to deal with what's over here on the left, because that's the foundation for that, and that's what the kids with the phonological core deficit do not have. Okay, our time is up, and lunch, is that right? That's what's coming up? Thanks for your attention.